I'm here today at my parents' shop where I have worked for years now. I have worked on our family vehicles, on our business equipment, and all different kinds of equipment, anything with a motor I have worked on. And while all of that is very interesting, the thing I'm really proud to show you today is this. This is that project. Model A has a lot of unique features that we don't see a lot in cars today, and it also has a lot of things that we do see in cars today, but are much more advanced and have been developed over the 91 years that this truck has been in existence, and even earlier for some other Model A's. Some of those things are like what's usual in every engine. This is a 40 horsepower car. That's double what the Model T was at 20 horsepower, but still well below what even some of the least powered, the most underpowered cars today have. It has a 201 cubic inch or 3.33 liter displacement, which is the amount of fuel and air you can fit into the cylinders. That's just the volume of the cylinders. It's an inline 4, which means it has 4 cylinders arranged all in a row. It has a flat head, which means the head is just a slab of metal covering the engine. In modern engines, it is much more advanced because it contains the valves, and sometimes it contains the cams and gears and all those things. In this engine, those are off to the side. That's why it's called a flat head. They come up through the side instead of going down from the top. The reason that we don't see it a lot anymore is power and compression. Compression is the most efficient way to gain efficiency and power in your engine. And with the valves off to the side, you can only compress the gas so much and you're always losing it to the sides because you have to have the cutouts for those valves. With it coming down from the top, those valves only open when the cylinder is at the bottom, so they can move as much as possible, open as much as they need, and the gases can come in and out more efficiently, and there's no loss to compression to the side. The compression ratio on this car isn't very good compared to modern cars, but back then it was actually pretty good. It had, in the 1928 model, it had a compression ratio of 4.3 to 1, but from 1929 to 1931 that was changed so that the compression ratio was 4.22 to 1. It's not that much of a difference, but it was easier to manufacture and they could make it cheaper for the masses. The transmission in this is very common, up to even the 50s and 60s for manual cars. It's a 3-speed transmission, so you have first, second, and third going forward, but you also have 1 reverse gear. The cooling system, the radiator and the water jacket, they have a capacity of 3 gallons of a mix of water and antifreeze, or whatever you put in there. You could put just straight water in there and it would be fine in warmer climates, but antifreeze is to keep the tubes and the water jacket from freezing, and when ice freezes, or when water freezes into ice, it expands and it will cause cracks and damage to everything, then you have to replace, and that's very expensive. The radiator flow rate, that's how fast the onboard water pump pumps the water through the system. It is actually a fairly high one for cars. We don't see it that high really today. Some cars are like that, more performance cars, maybe higher, but this is actually a fairly high pressure system for the amount of liquid in there at 38 gallons per minute. So all of that water in there, those 3 gallons are moving very quickly through. Very unusual, we don't see this much anymore, but this is a 6-volt electrical system. Modern cars all run on 12 volt, and that's just because engines have gotten bigger and more complex and computers have been installed, and in order to run all that and provide the power to turn over the engine to start it, we just need more power in our batteries, and the way they did that is they doubled it by moving it from 6 to 12 volt. Another unusual thing about this is to ground out the system, to get the electrical circuits working properly, they use a positive ground system. This is unusual because most modern cars, they use negative ground. So it's a bit backwards, but it works pretty close to the same. It's just a quirk of this car that was changed for ease of manufacturing and ease of use later on. The gas tank changed over the years. From 1928 to 29, it had a 10-gallon gas tank, which sits right up in the dash. That was because in the Model T it was under the seat, but because it was there, gravity couldn't feed it properly going up the hill. So going up hills, you would have to go up backwards to get the remainder of your fuel if you had a low amount of fuel in there to get it to feed into your engine. That's kind of been changed here because the drain is more towards the center, and it's an oval, so it goes in to the drain, so you'll always have fuel. 28 to 29, they used 10-gallon tanks, but in the 30 to 31 models, they decided to change that to an 11-gallon tank, but the 11th gallon was an emergency extra gallon. So the tank reads in fractions, so you will have 1 as your full tank, 3/4, 1/2, 1/4, and then once you get to 0, you still have 10% left in the tank, or an extra 10%, because the gauge will go below 0, and that is your cue that you are running out of fuel, so you should pull over and refuel. These were not especially good on fuel, but for the time, just getting from one place to the next was more than enough. Not having to feed your horse hay or ride a bicycle, that was a major plus. This has 4-wheel drum brakes, which some cars at that time had 2-wheel drum brakes, but that was more unusual. Most had 4. The Model T even had 4 for just about all of its production life. And something unusual about these brakes is most brakes, especially today, all brakes today, are operated through a hydraulic system. All that means is you have a fluid, and when you push the brake, it pushes on this incompressible fluid, and then that fluid will push on your brakes, and that will engage your brakes. Well, in this Model A, that hadn't really been developed yet. Some more high-end cars had them. I think Cadillac at this time was starting to develop it, but a lot of European sports cars, even at this time, would start to install them. But that was kind of unreliable in Ford's view, so Ford decided to go with a manual linkage between all the brakes, which just means that there is a rod connected to the brake pedal. So when you push on the brake pedal, the rod goes out and pushes on the brakes and engages them. This does not really provide nearly as much stopping power as we would hope for cars today, but for cars back then, where a lot of stuff like that wasn't really an issue, it was perfectly adequate for the time. So inside the Model A, there are quite a lot of features that are unique to this car, but quite a lot of features we even see in cars today, and you can see where they come from. Here we have our steering wheel, our horn, and our light switch. All the way to the left here is low beams without the rear lights on. Then pushing it one over is nothing on. This, then one over to the right, would be low beams with the rear lights on for nighttime driving. And then all the way over is low beams, high beams, and the rear lights on for nighttime driving. Over here, we have our timing switch. This changes the timing of the truck. It determines when the fuel is ignited inside of the engine. As you speed up and down, it has to change. This has been automated since the 40s, 50s. And we don't see that in cars today. On the other side of the steering wheel is our hand throttle. This is an improvement over the Model T, as the Model T only had the hand throttle, but this car has a foot throttle. Down below, we have our 4 pedals. Here you see the clutch, then you see the brake. The foot throttle is the little black pedal right there, and the starter pedal is that silver one right in behind. That is what you use to start the car. The key is not actually what you use to start. Down below, you have your shifter. It is a manual transmission, 3-speed. The pattern goes all the way up to the left is reverse, and then down is first, over up to the right, second, down to the right is third. Beside it, you have your handbrake for parking, standard in all cars even to today, and then you have your gauges out in the middle here. The gauges are very limited in their scope and what they tell you. Off to the left here is your key. That just turns on the circuit for the ignition coil to allow the engine to fire. That doesn't actually start the starter. That's what the pedal's for. Up here you have your gasoline gauge. That goes by quarters. So here we are in the emergency fuel level below 0. Then you have 0, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and a full tank. Down here you have your amp meter. This tells you if your battery is charging or discharging, and that will warn you if you're paying attention before your battery will die. And down here you have your odometer for distance, and you have your speedometer. It goes up to 80, but the car probably wouldn't do that unless you're going downhill. It is not a particularly fast car. Off to the side here we have our mixture and choke. Pulling it out is the choke. That helps you start it. That was in cars up to the 80s, but in fuel-injected cars with computers, that has gone the way of the dodo bird. Adjusting fuel mixture is twisting it side to side like that. That just adjusts how much fuel there is in relation to the air. That helps it in thinner air and thicker air. You have to adjust it to have less fuel and more fuel. And when starting, you want to have a little more fuel so that it will start a little easier, but then once it's running, you want to lean it out so that you're not wasting fuel. Off to the side here is really what's left in the cab here. You have your hand-cranked windows. Those were around for a very long time. Fairly standard in cars, not so much today anymore, but they used to be. Then you have your door handles. The door handles are unique in they actually go upwards to open instead of moving side to side. There are a variety of door handles, but these are fairly unique. Here we have the air conditioning system for this vehicle. The windshield pops out by unscrewing this and just pushing it outwards. That allows airflow to blow in and cool you off with a nice breeze. The vent right here actually angles the air coming in through here and then down straight to your feet down below. It actually works fairly well, but it's a whole lot worse than air conditioning, I can tell you that. One of the most interesting parts of this car, to me at least, being a car enthusiast, is the engine bay, because the engine bay is quite unique. A lot of similarities are there to what you would see today, but there are also a lot of differences in there. I've already taken off the locking handles, but to close the hood down, you have to take this. Try and do this while showing you. Take this and pull it out and put it down on these little tabs. But I've already done the luxury of taking those off because they are quite tight and they hold the hood on quite tight. Modern cars, they slam down and latch, but this is just a little different. The hood opens sideways, which is quite unique. And then that reveals what's inside. Inside, you have actually a very empty engine bay. You can see in there a lot of the important things. Here is your oil filler cap. If you want to do an oil change, that's where you would go change it. You have your generator right here, your water pump right there with the fan, and then you have your pulley down there that runs off the crankshaft. In the middle of that actually is a little hole there, which you can put a crank in there and crank start it in case you did run out of your starter, wasn't working or whatever. But that is very difficult and you would have to be very, very strong to do so. These two pipes are for the cooling system. The water travels in this direction going up and then down. Because of the high pressure, it can do that, but it's would be difficult with a lower pressured system, but not impossible. It cools down and then goes right back there and sucks more heat out, and that prevents the engine from overheating. If you wanted to see how hot your engine is getting, your temperature gauge is right here on the back of the radiator cap, and to open it you can just twist it and open it back. More interesting stuff in here. You have your steering column that goes down from your steering wheel and twists, turns some gears, and turns the car. Fairly self-explanatory. There's no power steering, so it's a straight geared system right into the wheels. You can feel everything. Beside that, you have your starter motor. That is just to start the car. Every car has them, except for some really early cars. Didn't work when we got the car at first, but we managed to figure out what was wrong with it, and I'll be explaining that soon. This is why they're called flatheads. This is a very low profile head. That's why they're called flat. That's because the valves are off to the side, on the other side where the timing is there. It's very simple than that. Modern heads are a lot taller, and they hold cams and valves in them, and valve guides and valve springs and all those kinds of things. These are very simple by comparison. They're basically just a metal cap that goes on the top of it. On top of that, you can see the distributor. The way that works is a electrical current is fed into the ignition coil. Through magnetism, it steps up the voltage from 6 volts to 1,000 volts or more, well over 1,000 volts. And what that does is it allows it to bridge a gap in the spark plug, and that gap creates a spark, and that is what ignites the fuel. The same way that if you've ever lit a campfire, you start a flame and then it starts a bigger flame somewhere else. That's essentially what this does. Spark is one of the necessary components in a gasoline engine. You have compression, air, fuel, and spark. Those are the 4 main components of a power stroke in an engine. In the distributor, there is a rotor in there that spins around. What that does is there's 4 posts inside of it. And when it gets close to there, the spark jumps the gap, and then it travels through these little copper plates. Modern cars have wires which are insulated. This does not. They're just copper plates that lock in. They jump the gap, go through those plates into the spark plug, and then they go through the spark plug and generate the spark. It's fairly simple. It's very difficult to set the timing for when the spark is released just perfectly, but once you have it, it doesn't change and you don't have to reset it. It's fairly simple. You can see up here you have your gas cap. It makes it very interesting to fill it, especially with gas cans, as we have discovered. It's doable, but you have to be very careful not to put any gas on the paint, because gas can strip paint off and damage it. You have your low beams right here. They're not very powerful. You wouldn't want to do much driving with them. You have your spare tire here. This wasn't on for years. We just recently put it on because it was easier to work on the engine without it. Spare tire, you take it off if you're in trouble, put it back on, and you can put your blown out tire or flat tire in there. So the rear end isn't particularly interesting. Just going over it hasn't changed much with modern cars. I mean, it's just a style preference. Right here we have the rear window. The rear window isn't particularly large, but it's adequate if you're backing up. A lot of people when backing up have a spotter to help them park it properly. I find that's helpful for me personally, but I've also been able to do that without, because the window isn't too small. It was smaller in the Model T, and this window size is more of an issue if you're in a sedan, because this window is the same size, but instead of being right behind you, it's all the way back here, so it's considerably smaller, and you're looking at a lot more metal than window. Moving forward, you have your brake lights on each side. They do turn on when you're reversing. You have your reversing lights and your brake lights. Haven't changed in the last 100 years, really. There is a license plate holder right here. Modern cars have two, one on the front, one on the rear. That's not something that they really designed for back then. Even in the States today, you only need one license plate on the rear in a lot of states. That's kind of the idea this car was developed for. So it only has the one. ICBC isn't really clear on what you have to do, and when we get the license plate registered, we'll be crossing that road. You have your rear bumper at the bottom. It's split into two with these little emblems here. They're only supposed to have one blue in them. I think it looks kind of strange. Maybe we'll paint another blue emblem in, but it is what it is. The tailgate, instead of having a latch like you would think of, it has two chains on each side. You pull the chain out, push it in, twist this one, and if you put the chain back in, it actually levels it off perfectly flat. And then the covers on the chains aren't actually standard with the vehicle. These were made by the original restoring owner. His wife actually made them. This is so when you're driving, the chains don't flop around and hit the metal and scratch either the chain or the metal. They're nice to have. They're actually made out of the same material that the roof is made out of. The metal, the tailgate is just pure metal. It says Ford embossed in, and the floor of the bed here is chrome and wood. The original owner actually did a very good job, though we did shine up a lot of the chrome because it was dusty and dirty and got some stuff on it. On the glass, on the side windows, rear window, and windshield, there was actually a lot of paint, little spots of paint, which I went through with a razor and I cut the paint off. It's not a particularly large bed. You can fit some stuff in there. You can fit a few small hay bales for the time, but a sheet of plywood is actually too large for this bed. So that's why modern truck beds are much, much larger, so you can fit a much larger payload. This car has a really rich and storied past, and I want to talk about that a little bit. The engine, the serial number, star 81849 star, that is the serial number for just the engine. The parts came from different cars when it was restored in the 90s, starting in the 90s. The engine serial number would prove to become the VIN number for the car, and it would be printed on the chassis. Because this is a different engine than this truck originally had, there should be a different VIN number on the frame, but we do not know that because we'd have to take it all off again, and it'd be difficult to see because it would probably be painted over by now. Maybe one day we will take it all apart with a crane, but that's much too difficult for us to do now when nothing's broken and it works perfectly fine. The engine, we know the original manufacture date approximately. It was in January 1929 in Windsor, Ontario. That much we know. We don't know the exact date in January, but my estimate from the tables of serial numbers I could find is somewhere around the 11th, somewhere around mid-January it was produced. This truck worked hard for its first few years. We don't know what happened to it until the chassis and body of it were found in a field in Chilliwack, and that is where the original owner found it. He didn't buy it, but what happened was he was in a car accident, unfortunately, where he became disabled, and he was forced to retire from his job and take a pension and disability pay, and he was very distraught over the whole matter. So what he did was he started a type of therapy for himself with this car. He started it to try and gain back some motor function skills, to make himself happier, and he thought that this would be a relatively easy yet rewarding project, and that's exactly what it's turned out to be for me. He put a lot of effort into it. He took the frame off completely. He found a new engine, but it was an old one, and he rebuilt the whole thing. He rebuilt all of the suspension, he rebuilt the body, he repainted the body. He did so much work to it. It was 25 years of work. He finished his involvement in the project in 2015 when he hit his mid-80s and was no longer able to work. So he sold it to his neighbor down the road, who we bought it from. The neighbor didn't do all that much with it. Never really had the time. He was working on other projects, and eventually he sold it to make room. And that's where we saw it online and we bought it, because this is honestly quite the cool car. There's not a lot more history than that that we know of. We know that it was built in Canada. We know that it worked in Canada its whole life. And I'm proud that it's still Canadian. Despite a lot of the major bodywork and painting being done, there's still a lot to do. A lot of the frame was still unpainted underneath in spots where it had been ground down or rusted out or flaked off, so we had to repaint that. The first major thing we did when we got it was we tackled oil change. It had been sitting with oil for 4 years, sitting oil and all that, and all the lubricants, not the best, so we dumped all that. We dumped the engine oil, we dumped the differential oil, we dumped the steering box oil, and we replaced it all with new oil. After that, we tackled the running gear and the suspension. The suspension has a lot of grease fittings for lubrication. Because they sat for 4 years, so many were plugged that the ones we couldn't unplug, we had to take out and put new ones in. Luckily, it was fairly easy. It took a couple days to do so because they're so stuck in place, but they're not screwed in like typical ones today. They're actually push-in grease fittings. They are a relic of the time, really. Maybe it's worth it for some people to replace it with screwed-in grease fittings, but if you want historical accuracy, like really me and my dad did want a lot of, we left it with the push style because they're still around, but they're not common anymore. After that was tackled, we went for the electric problem. It didn't turn over, the lights didn't work, there was a lot. So we looked through the wiring diagrams and we figured out it was wired up backwards in one spot, so we switched it around and then it started to work, but not really. It was dim, it didn't turn over very well. So we kept investigating, and while looking, I found that the ground, like I said, the ground was on paint, which is not very conductive and kept the electricity from passing through, and that's what kept the electricity from flowing freely and the system reaching its full capacity. So we ground it all off and fixed it, like I said. Then with that fixed, it ran perfectly. After that was done, we focused on trying to start it because it still didn't run right. The electric motor, it still wasn't running perfectly. So we had to pull start it behind our garden tractor for our yard here. That kind of worked. It fired. It was trying to run, and we figured out that it was actually out of time. The timing was wrong. So we adjusted that, and we managed to get it to run, but it didn't run very stable, and it would shut off, and it would backfire very often. So we knew the backfiring was a problem with the carburetor, and running stable was a problem with the timing. So that set about 3 months of tinkering with the timing and about 4 months of tinkering with the carburetor. In that time, we managed to fix the timing by setting it with the setting screw in there. It's very hard to find the right setting because it's very small adjustments. And the carburetor we actually had with the spare parts that came with this. We had 3 separate carburetor kits. So we ended up building all 3 of them and trying them out to see if they were a machining problem that was keeping them from working properly. And we ended up figuring out that we had there was a defect in a lot of the jets, which caused them to give too much fuel. Turns out we had all 3 of them. It was common in Canada. So we ended up fixing the defect, and it runs perfectly fine now. We then fixed the starter. The starter just had some dirty brushes on it because early electric motors had brushes for the electricity to pass through. Modern electric motors that are more powerful are brushless, but that's much more modern, years and decades ahead of this. We also had a problem with our transmission here. When we were out washing it one day, we went to put it in, and the shifting lever just broke in two pieces. Originally they were a single piece cast all together. Because this piece we found out was Chinese reproduction, they had two pieces that they had welded together. The weld wasn't very strong, these welded aluminum, and it had broken in two, right in two. So we ended up replacing that. That was one thing that we didn't do fully on our own. We sought out help from this amazing guy named Mike Breed out in Brookswood. He has been working on Model A since he was 16, and he is retired now, but still works for himself in his own shop and for friends and other people. He showed us what we had to do, and we only went to him because there's a specialized tool that you need that he has, and the spring in there is under so much tension that if let go improperly, it could cause serious physical harm to you, and could actually in some cases it has actually gone straight through people like a bullet. So due to safety concerns, we sought out his help. He also would check out a lot of the stuff that we did to the running gear to make sure that it would be proper and safe. Some of it we missed, and he found and fixed for us so that it was in safe working order. That is one thing I'm happy we had him do, a professional do, because safety is no joke. And safety is one of the top priorities that you can have. We replaced the battery in it, and one of the major problems we had here was brake problems. When you push down on the brake pedal, it would actually hold down and keep the brakes on when you're moving. It was a big problem because while you could fix it by just pulling back on the brake pedal with your foot or your hand, when you're driving down the road, if you forget, your brakes are wearing out and slowing you down. Not ideal, so what I did is I went through the brake system and figured out that we had some of the return springs installed backwards, and they were actually damaged because they were original return springs. So we fixed the damage, turned them around, and we managed to fix the brakes. That was quite the experience, because those rods are quite long, and there was a million things it could have been. There's a lot of return springs due to it being mechanical. So investigating that took another couple weeks. Fixing it took another couple weeks after that, so it's probably a month-long project to fix the brakes. While working on it, we had the gas valve break in half. That was not a very pleasant experience, but gas everywhere. But we fixed that, we replaced that, which we were happy to do. We cleaned out the gas tank because it was full of all sorts of crud and buildup of dry gasoline. So we cleaned all that out, and now it's fairly clean. One of our major projects, I think the biggest project we had to do, was due to the fan inside breaking apart. The fan is one piece with the pulley behind it to turn it, and in the original fan that we had, that was four-bladed, the pulley had, one of the blades of the pulley had actually separated off and was no longer turning, which was a problem because you need that to spin your water pump. So in order to replace that, because everything's so tight in the front, we had to remove the radiator, unplug all the lights, we had to remove the fan, remove the water pump, clean the water pump, and we replaced the fan. But in doing so, we realized that the key that goes on the shaft to keep the fan from spinning in place as the shaft spins, that was also damaged in our removal, so we had to roughly machine it back to spec. The radiator, we found out, was an original 90 at that time year old radiator. It was barely passing water through. It was completely clogged, very corroded. We ended up sending it to a radiator shop that specializes in this kind of stuff, and they took the measurements and figured out how it was put together, took the top and bottom pieces off. They cut the tubing for it, and they rebuilt a new radiator for us so that it cools much better. And even now we can even just feel from the radiant heat how much better it's working. That was a major project. That was about 3 or 4 months worth. So a lot of these things seem easy when I'm talking about it, but there's good reason why this has taken us 2 years to deal with. Another major issue that this truck came to us with is that it did not have a roof. It just had the frame and a single layer of fabric. We did not end up doing the actual roof itself by ourselves because we are not upholsterers. We come from a family of clothing designers and seamstresses, but this is not something that I have the time to do, and we were limited in the amount of material we had. And we knew a friend of ours that does upholstery and this kind of stuff for boat covers, and he actually specializes in roofs for old cars and convertibles. So he was a natural choice. We painted all of the drip railings here and all of the metal that goes onto this, and we provided all the tacks and roofing material, but in the end he ended up putting it on. Again, we have very little regrets about that, because if it were to leak, we would have to take it all apart and redo everything, and it's a fairly costly thing, and it would be cheaper for us to have it done professionally and correct than have to do it twice and maybe even more by ourselves. All these things we had to do were fairly complex, and a lot of it I couldn't have done without what I learned in school. When I went to buy parts or meet new people like Mike Breed for the first time, that before was very difficult for me. I have a very hard time being social, and a lot of school has taught me that, and specifically leadership that I took from grades 10 through 12, that has helped me a lot in terms of communication. Communication I have struggled a bit with all throughout my life, but after that I noticed that I was much better with it, especially with strangers that I was not really comfortable with. Another major thing was in physics. We learned a whole lot about the properties of electricity. That's how I figured out the ground was on a insulator, which prevented it from working correctly. If not for that, it may have taken me much longer to figure that out, or it may not have been me at all. Another major thing from physics was wiring diagrams. We did a lot of wiring, especially in grade 11 physics, and some of it in grade 10 science, which had all kinds of sciences in it. That allowed me to understand the wiring diagrams for this truck and discover the wiring fault in the harness that was causing all the electrical problems. That was a major help. If not for that, I may have never understood it properly, but because I learned it at school, I didn't have to worry about that. A major thing from PE is physical dexterity. This truck, despite being small, is very heavy. It's made out of cast iron for the most part, and no aluminum to make it lighter, and it is heavy. When we had to remove the radiator, that weighed alone probably about 120 pounds. It's heavy, and if not for that and the training I do in that in PE, I did have a lot of that in outside of school sports, but PE really stepped up with the weight room, which I hadn't done before, and weight training. That really helped me get through this. In socials and history more specifically, and some English classes, we did a lot of inquiry projects. Inquiry projects are great because they help me develop my research and being able to research. That helped me a lot in here because they don't make a lot of this stuff anymore. It's very niche. The place where you can get parts or find knowledgeable people are very limited in number, and you really have to look into it on the internet and everywhere and call people and read up on it. And even some procedures, there's a lot that you need to do. If not for researching, this project would have never gotten done, and I never grew up with this. My dad grew up with the Model T, so he knew a lot of this stuff, but the people who designed these cars 100 years ago, most of them aren't around anymore, and even the people who repaired them, they're starting to disappear. So being able to research documents and find statements in books and that kind of stuff is incredibly important when you're storing one of these things. Two things I learned from skills that were incredibly important in this project were from Metal Shop and Skills 8. I learned a lot about using tools like saws and files in that class, and with that I was able to machine down the key for the shaft that holds the fan on. If not for that, I probably would have learned it at home, but with the extra practice and extra knowledge I gained from class, from someone who teaches that professionally, that really helped me to understand what I needed to do and how much I needed to file to clean it up. And the other thing is metalworking. Ability. Some stuff here we had to put in shims of metal. Sometimes it was wooden shims, which I also learned in the metal shop. Another skill I learned was metalworking and woodworking. I did some of that at home before, but not very much. One of the things I learned was shims, which are little wedges that hold things in place. I learned how to make them both in metal and wood at school, and I use that here because a lot of the different components are shimmed in place. The radiator has a shim to keep it from wobbling. The cab of the truck and all the other body styles are shimmed in place to keep them from squeaking or wobbling or making any kind of noise, and that's something that I really needed here. And then the last skill that I used that isn't really necessary for the truck itself, but expands upon communication, was my musical ability from band, which I took from grade 8 through 12. It was one of my favorite classes, but I didn't know much going in, but going out I know quite a bit. And that actually allowed me to relate to to Mike Breed, because when he was younger, he used to play guitar and play the saxophone. So with that, I was able to connect to him better and relate to how he was as a kid, because me starting out at 16 years old, talking to him, wanting to learn more about this, it reminded him a lot about himself. And with that connection, we really were able to communicate better. The communication would have been there, but not to the same degree without it. This project is due to be completed very soon in the future. There are only 4 main things that need to be done, and many of them are just minor, such as this. The carriage bolts need to be replaced and machined down, on the body there. That will hold it in place and from twisting more, but that's more an issue in higher powered cars where the frame actually twists and the body twists. It's not an issue here. It's more of an aesthetic thing that we would like to do. The other thing we need to do is license plate and insurance registration. We want to drive this. We don't know how much we would like to do that, so we're not sure if we're going to do collector car. A collector's plate would be nice because of the cheapened insurance, but my dad, being it in fire truck red, my dad was thinking maybe taking it to work, but to do that he can't take it with a collector's plate. Collector's is only supposed to be for pleasure. The other thing we're thinking is maybe a parade plate, but that is only for going to parades or participating or heading home. That is far too restrictive. We don't like the restrictions that imposes on it. Same story with vintage car. It's similar to collector car, but you can't take it to work or to school. We'd like the freedom to do that more, so we may just do a typical license plate like you would see, a beautiful British Columbia blue and white one. ICBC isn't super clear on these rules, which we have to look into, but this car is was not developed for a front license plate. Some people put one with zip ties over this rock guard. The issue with that is it blocks the flow of air as it hits that, and that increases the heating of the engine. It could do, but if you drive long distances in it, it will overheat the engine over time and stress it. We don't really want that, so we're not so sure about what the future may hold for that. Either way, we'll end up putting license plate on it because we really do want to drive it. Another main issue with the car that we will be solving going forward is just touching up all the little bits of paint and scratches that are missing. As you can see right here on the hood, there's a large scratch right there. And there's a variety of other ones all over the car that either we will be touching up and waxing and clear coating ourselves, or we will have it professionally done so that we can just have it look nice with minimal effort on our part. Here also there are some drops of black paint on the red paint. These are also very minor, and it's a very, very nitpicky thing, but we would like it to be perfect and look its best all the time. The chrome is all shiny and there's no scratches on that. It's just the paint that has to be redone. As you can see, over time, the paint has worn off of the chain here and on top where it's rusted. And on the tailgate itself, it's been chipped off from use. That's another issue that we need to have fixed just for aesthetic reasons. But other than that, the truck is basically ready to go in the aesthetic department. Another couple things that we would like to do in the future that are relatively minor and not very necessary are to do with lighting and turn signals. The brake lights are bright enough, but one of the things that we've wanted to do is to install a small LED light in here for the license plate, so you can see your license plate at night. We probably wouldn't be driving it at night, so that's not an issue, but in case we ever do, maybe that may be a consideration for the future. The main project for the future with this thing is turn signals. Turn signals are not a standard feature on this car, and they weren't even an option. Even today, turn signals are very limited for this car and very expensive because they're very difficult to install. We would like to install some kind of turn signal system in here, but we also want to design a mounting system for it that makes it easy to connect and disconnect so that we can put it in competitions for originality and win and try and win those as well and be competitive. Because turn signals are not competitive, but they are safe. And being from a first responder family with my uncle as a paramedic and my dad as a firefighter, this is something that we definitely want to have just for the safety of whoever is driving, whether it be me or him or my mother. Thank you for watching my Capstone project. This has been an amazing journey all the way through. From the start of this project, when we found this truck on the internet and picking it up in Chilliwack, out to now being able to tell the world about what I've done with it, because I've talked about it to friends and even done a small presentation in class to a handful of people before, but I've never really shown this to anyone. And I'm really proud to say that this is what I've done. And hopefully this is as interesting to you as it was to me. Thank you for watching.